Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. They shot an old man, but they had no idea what was coming next. It was an ordinary morning in the quiet little town of Fairfield, nestled in the southern United States, where the days seemed to pass in slow motion, punctuated by the same habits, the same faces, the same familiar streets. The sun, still timid, was beginning to break through the horizon, casting a golden light on the pastel facades of the houses, where the flags hanging from the porches flapped gently. The air hung with the scent of freshly ground coffee, mingling with the smell of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. Birdsong punctuated the still pure silence, broken only by the distant drone of an engine or the swishing of a watering can over the fresh grass. The inhabitants of Maple Street, one of the neighborhood's most peaceful residential streets, would never have imagined that a tragedy would soon unfold beneath their windows. A morning like so many others, until the irreparable happened. At the corner of the street, slowly advancing Walter Jenkins, a 78-year-old black man, his gait hesitant, his breath short but dignified. In his wrinkled hand, he held a small paper bag containing a loaf of bread, a folded newspaper, and a box of tea. Walter had never left his small house in Fairfield, even after the war. He often said, "I fought for this country. This neighborhood is my land." On his shoulders he carried a worn wool military coat, still adorned with an old hand-sewn patch. A carved wooden cane, which he had carved himself a decade ago, punctuated his slow steps. Everyone in the neighborhood greeted him with respect. They called him Captain Walt. To some kids, he was the neighborhood hero, the man with the war stories. To the old-timers, he was a silent pillar, the one who never spoke a word louder than anyone else. But this morning, something was going to break this harmony. A little further on, in a patrol car, two young officers were making their rounds. It was their first joint mission. Officer Bradley Cooper, 26, nervous, compulsively scratched his onboard radio. Beside him, Kyle Sanders, 24 years old, impulsive, his gaze tense behind his sunglasses, kept his hand on his weapon as if he were waiting for an excuse. The radio crackled. African-American suspect, approximately 5 feet 9 inches, dark clothing, fleeing after an armed robbery on Jefferson Street. Considered potentially armed. Respond with caution. At that precise moment, as they were turning on Maple Street, they saw Walter. He was walking alone. Long coat. Cane in hand. African-American. Old. And that's all they saw. "Maybe it's him," Cooper said, his palms sweating. "Look at his clothes." "Maybe he's running away in his own way," Sanders replied confidently. Without waiting, Sanders turned on the emergency lights. The car braked abruptly with a screech of tires. The birds flew away in panic. Walter, surprised, slowly turned around. On the ground, "Hands up," Sanders yelled, pulling out his gun. Walter raised his arms in confusion. "Gentlemen. I think you are mistaken," he said in a trembling but calm voice. But Sanders couldn't hear any more. He saw, suspect. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I told you get down." Walter tried to comply, but his right leg buckled. He put down his cane, tried to kneel, and stumbled. His bag fell, the bread rolled onto the asphalt. And as his knee barely touched the ground, a gunshot tore through the morning. A sharp, thunderous sound. The echo resonated against the quiet walls of Fairfield. A bullet. Just one. She knocked Walter on the left shoulder, throwing him to the ground, his face hitting the cold concrete. His coat slowly stained red. He let out a barely audible groan, shocked, more than hurt. A woman's scream split the air. "What did you do?" A young passerby, Emily Torres, ran towards him, his phone in hand, filming, screaming for help. Neighbors ran out. Doors opened. Children were ushered away. An adolescent, Jordan Miller, began to shout. "You just shot Mr. Jenkins. He's a veteran." Tensions rose. The police retreated, overwhelmed. The crowd's faces morphed from incomprehension to fury. And in the center of this growing chaos, Walter Jenkins, a man of peace, lay on the ground, unable to understand how his life had changed in a few seconds. But what no one knew yet. This shot had just lit a fuse. And on the other side of the country, Hassan was going to get up. At the Fairfield Central Hospital, the usual calm of the emergency department had given way to an electric tension. In operating room number 3, the lights were focused on the weakened body of Walter Jenkins, lying on the table, his shirt cut off, his skin marked with old scars, and now, with a new injury, cruel and unjustified. The doctor Amelia Rowe, head of the trauma unit, struggled to contain the bleeding. Her face was focused, tense, almost furious. She knew Walter. He was the one who came every month to distribute words of encouragement to the young patients in the war-wounded unit. His pulse is dropping. Oxygen at 95, blood pressure unstable, hold that vein. A heavy silence reigned despite the noise of the machines. No one dared to say out loud what everyone else was thinking: a living legend was shot. In the lobby, news was already circulating. Nurses whispered among themselves. Patients looked up at the television mounted on the wall, where a video was playing on a loop, an old man falling to the floor, his arms raised, and the chilling scream of a woman yelling, "He didn't do anything." Meanwhile, at 200 kilometers away, in a top-secret military base in Nevada, a red light flashed in an operating room locked by biometric code. In a windowless room, where only the buzzing of surveillance systems could be heard, a secure phone rang, breaking the silence. A man standing in front of a satellite map of the eastern United States slowly turned around. It was Colonel Marcus Jenkins, Commander-in-Chief of the Delta Force, responsible for the country's most secret and sensitive special operations. A man feared by his enemies, respected by his men, and dreaded even in the halls of the Pentagon. His face, carved like stone, always impassive, never betrayed the slightest emotion, until that day. He picked up. "Colonel Marcus Jenkins." A deep voice answered, unusually cautious. "Colonel, this is Central Command. We just received a priority alert. Your father, Walter Jenkins, has been wounded. By local police. They fired. He's in intensive care." The world seemed to stop for a split second. Marcus didn't speak right away. He turned away from the map and closed his eyes. His breathing stopped. He stood frozen, his fist clenched. Then he asked, in an icy tone, "Is this filmed?" "Yes, Colonel. It's already going viral. The press is starting to pick up on it." At that moment, the man disappeared behind the officer. He was no longer the colonel. He was the son of a man he admired, respected, almost venerated. Walter Jenkins wasn't just a father. He was his moral reference point, the man who, despite a life of struggle, had taught him patience, restraint, and nobility in pain. The one who had told him, never shoot first, but be prepared to be the last one standing. He opened his eyes again. Hard. Frozen. He sat up, picked up the phone, and spoke in a low but sharp voice. "Immediately mobilize Bravo Unit and Delta Team. Objective, Colonel. Civil intervention mission. Securing, extracting, and neutralizing if necessary. I take command on the ground." "Understood, Colonel." Authorization granted. He hung up. Then, turning to his deputy, Captain Monroe, he simply added, "We're leaving for Fairfield. In an hour. Tell my men to gear up. This isn't a military operation anymore. It's personal." Marcus Jenkins, Colonel U Delta Force, was a living legend in American military circles. A man whose name circulated in hushed tones at the highest levels, whose face never appeared in the newspapers, but whose interventions changed the course of entire conflicts. He was methodical, silent, almost mechanical in his discipline. It was said of him that he could remain impassive in the face of absolute chaos. But that day, he was no longer an elite officer. He was a wounded son. And a son wounded by injustice is a force that nothing can contain. In the cockpit of AIM-60 Black Hawk tactical helicopter he sat wordlessly, his eyes fixed on the screen of his tablet where the video of the shooting was playing. Every image lacerated him. The moment when Walter, his father, raised his arms. The scream of the police officer. The falling body. The flowing blood. Behind him, his men, a dozen Delta operators, silent, prepared, heavily equipped. Not a word. Not a wasted gesture. They all knew Walter Jenkins. He had visited them on the base, shaken their hands, shared war memories, talked about what it truly meant to serve one's country. They loved him. Respected him. The operation now had a sober and icy code name, Silent Justice. Less than 2 hours after the shooting, the small town of Fairfield looked like a military extraction zone. The sky was blackened by the rotors of helicopters. Armored Humvees surrounded the municipal commissariat, which had become the epicenter of the scandal. Inside, the officers present no longer knew whether to obey, flee, or hide. Men in black uniforms, tactical helmets, and thermal goggles rappelled down onto the roof of the building. They didn't shout. They didn't exchange a word with the local forces. They confiscated the weapons off the 2 officers responsible for the shooting, Cooper and Sanders. Stunned, did not dare to protest. Their badges were torn off on the spot, their cell phones sealed. Outside, a massive crowd had formed. Residents of Fairfield, Walter's neighbors, young people, old people, all gathered in an atmosphere charged with emotion and tension. Some were crying, others filming, children on their parents' shoulders stared at the sky with wide-open eyes. On social media, the wave was gaining momentum at breakneck speed. Hashtags #Justice for Walter, #Colonelcollar, and #Trocies were exploding on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. National television stations had sent teams. Journalists were commenting on the operation live, without knowing exactly who had taken control of the city. And then, suddenly, a change of atmosphere. A movement in the crowd. The people parted like the sea before Moses. An imposing man, dressed in an impeccable black uniform, appeared. He walked straight, without a word, his face closed, his eyes hard as steel. His step was slow but steady, measured, as if he were marching onto an invisible battlefield. The cameras focused on him. The whispers stopped. Even the tears fell silent. It was him. Colonel Marcus Jenkins. He stopped dead in his tracks in front of the 2 now handcuffed police officers, flanked by his men. They were pale. They recognized his face. They knew that their careers, perhaps their lives, had just changed. The colonel stared at them. His lips tightened slightly. Then he spoke. His voice was deep, slow, controlled, but each word rang out like an order. You shot a man who served this country long before you could walk. He paused. The crowd held its breath. A man who knew fire, death, suffering, to defend rights, that you trampled underfoot in a few seconds. He takes a step forward, standing a few inches from Sanders. You humiliated him. Shot him. Left him on the sidewalk like a criminal. But today, you're the one who's going to have to answer. He turned to his soldiers. Hand them over to the feds. Let them spend their first night in a facility where no one knows their badges. Then he faced the crowd. He looked up at those who were watching him, some with tears in their eyes, others with clenched fists. My father is alive. And as long as I breathe, I swear to you, justice will not be negotiated. A silence. Then a thunder of applause, shouts, tears. Marcus Jenkins did not come to sow terror. He came to restore honor. The affair took on a scale that no one could have foreseen. In the space of a few hours, the video of the shooting had been viewed millions of times. On the 24-hour news channels, the images were shown on a loop, the body of Walter Jenkins lying on the pavement, his cane a few meters away, the blood slowly spreading on the concrete. And just after, the arrival of Colonel Marcus Jenkins, a black, sword-straight silhouette, walking towards the police like justice incarnate. CNN made a special edition of it. MSNBC hosted a primetime debate, France 24, the BBC, Al Jazeera, even NHK in Japan broadcast the sequence, calling it a surge of honor in a fractured America. Military and legal experts took turns on the sets, recalling that Walter Jenkins, beyond being a respected veteran, represented a generation sacrificed for freedom, today betrayed by those supposed to protect it. The uproar was such that the President of the United States himself spoke at a national address. We owe Walter Jenkins more than just a tribute. What happened at Fairfield is a tragedy, a shame, but also a shock. I just spoke personally to Colonel Marcus Jenkins. I offered him our apologies, and above all, our commitment. In the process, an independent federal commission was established. Its purpose, to investigate abuses of power, discriminatory arrest procedures, and flaws in police training. The police Bradley Cooper and Kyle Sanders were immediately suspended and then indicted by a federal grand jury for excessive and illegal use of force, willful endangerment of a veteran unarmed, violation of civil rights, inappropriate conduct related to bias racial. The media discovered that this was not the first time that these two officers had been the subject of complaints. But until now, these complaints had been smothered, classified without follow-up by their hierarchy. Audio recordings from the previous year resurfaced, in which Sanders was heard joking on the radio. Another one of those old guys with the medal on his chest. They think they're untouchable. But in the midst of this storm, Marcus Jenkins refused to fuel hatred. Faced with calls for revenge and protesters wanting to march to police stations, he spoke out in an exclusive interview on CBS. This is not a war. This is not revenge. My father taught me that justice, true justice, is a lesson, not a punishment. I don't want a riot. I want people to understand. And above all, to never forget. His words, simple yet powerful, were taken up in schools, universities, and churches. They were written on signs. They were etched in memories. Meanwhile, in room 214 of the intensive care unit at Fairfield Hospital, calm had returned. Walter Jenkins, pale but conscious, opened his eyes again. The morning light filtered gently through the window. His breathing was shallow and ragged, but his eyes still shone with the quiet wisdom he had carried all his life. In front of him, Marcus, straight as a bronze statue, his eyes red with fatigue. Walter muttered. You came, Marcus. The colonel, without his tactical vest, dressed simply in a black shirt, knelt by the bed. Always, Dad. You taught me to fight for justice. I wasn't going to sit back. Walter smiled weakly. I didn't fall for nothing, then. A few days later, Fairfield experienced a moment that no one would forget. In the central square, transformed for the occasion, a solemn ceremony was organized by the Ministry of Defense. Flags fluttered in the wind. A stage had been set up. The Army band played an emotional version of America the Beautiful. Veterans in uniform, standing despite their age, saluted Walter like a brother in arms. Walter Jenkins, dressed in his restored military uniform, was pushed in a wheelchair by his son. He raised his hand in gratitude, his gaze fixed. The president gave a speech. Then, in a symbolic gesture, he presented him with a Civil Merit Medal, a rare distinction awarded to citizens who are victims of injustice while embodying the values of the Republic. But the most powerful moment was when Colonel Jenkins took the microphone, facing the crowd and cameras from around the world. They shot my father. Not because he was armed. But because he was black. Because he was old. Because he disturbed their idea of authority. He looked at the crowd. No anger in his eyes, but a flame. But that day, they awakened more than a veteran. They awakened the strength of a son. The anger of a people. And the honor of a hero. Silence. Then applause. Tears. Songs. The Walter Jenkins case became a case study in police academies. Control protocols were revised at the federal level. A law, called Jenkins Act, was voted to guarantee legal protection for veterans during identity checks. And every year in Fairfield on April 7, a silent march is held in memory of that day. Not to revive the pain, but to celebrate a truth. They shot an old man. But they woke America up.